Now, before we talk about the 5 types of ignition misfires, let's look at a secondary waveform in your manual. Now, what we've done here is we have listed the critical points. Now, I want to tell you right off the bat, point A and point B actually should never be analyzed on a secondary waveform, but let's go ahead and get this out of the way. We'll talk about them briefly, but we're going to really go into a comprehensive explanation on points A and B on a primary waveform. You're now looking at the anatomy of a secondary waveform. Point A is the point of primary turn on. Now, what we have to understand that when we're using a secondary kV probe on a DI system at the coil wire, we're picking everything up inductively. In other words, our lab scope is not hardwired into that circuit like it would be if we were back probing the primary negative terminal of the coil. So we can't really make any kind of good diagnostic decisions on point A of a secondary waveform. Now, that is a point of primary turn on. You will see it will waver back and forth slightly. It's perfectly normal, but here again, if we're going to make diagnostic decisions on point A, we want you to be on the primary side of that circuit. Point B is the point of primary turn off. Now, on your scope, when you look at these patterns during our hands-on demonstrations, you will notice that point B will be rock stable. Why? Because that's where we told the scope to trigger at on a horizontal scale. In other words, if we bring a number 1 trigger in, we told the scope to trigger right there, so any kind of dwell variation problems on the primary side of the circuit, point B will still be rock stable. Again, we're going to go to the primary side of the system a little bit later on to show you how easily those dwell variation problems show up, and we'll duplicate some of them for you. Now, point C is one of the more critical points of a secondary waveform. Now, remember the air gap principle? The spark plug air gap has the most influence on a secondary kV demand, along with compression and obviously along with air-fuel ratio. Since we are looking vertically at the secondary waveform, we all know that vertically on a scope screen, we're looking at voltages, obviously. Now, if you look in the bottom middle of your screen there, you'll notice that this scope is set on 2 kV per division. So you can see that point C, the kV demand at point C is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. You're roughly between 10 and 12 kV. Now, if this were a 45,000 gap spark plug, and this vehicle is at idle, you should be very, very happy with that kV demand. But let's just say that you were looking at you had a 45,000 gap system, it's the original plugs, you were scoping this car out, and let's just say that you're looking at something very high, 16, 18 kV, which we will show you. If the firing line voltage at point C is too high, then what happens, point E becomes too short. But let's go right down the waveform here, and let's talk about the other critical points first. Let's take a look at point D. Now, point D is what we call the spark kV point. Point D represents whether or not the fixed resistance in that circuit, in this case, cylinder number 1, is too high or too low. Now, you'll notice vertically here, point D comes in right just slightly below 2 kV. That tells us, again, that the fixed resistance is good. Let's say, for example, that we have too much resistance in a plug wire, or we have a corroded terminal between the high voltage tower, the distributor cap, and the plug wire, or maybe it's down there at the plug wire and the spark plug. If we have bad terminal connections, or again, excess resistance in a secondary plug lead, point D of the waveform will alert us to that. Typically, we'll tell you that once the spark kV point starts going much above 2 kV, you need to be very, very skeptical about a resistance problem in that circuit. As long as you're down around 2 kV, that basically guarantees us the fixed resistance value of that circuit is good. Now, let's focus on the most important portion of the secondary waveform, which is at point E, known as the spark line. Now, my years of training, I can tell you that most technicians seem to OD too much on the firing kV demand, which again was point C, and they kind of ignore, they haven't really analyzed point E. Try to remember that point E, known again as the spark line, is our window inside that combustion chamber. So since we're going horizontally across the scope screen, you will notice that the time base on our scope is 1 millisecond. So you can see very easily that my spark duration period is roughly about 1.4 milliseconds. We will tell you during this presentation and demonstrate it as well that your spark duration period should never, ever, ever dip below 1.3 milliseconds on any DI type system, domestically, European, or Asian. Now, you can see here at point E that the spark line is fairly smooth. We don't have a whole lot of turbulence in spark line because the car, as you can see, at 600 RPM is at idle. Now, again, we have to talk about the dynamics of looking at secondary. In other words, what we're basically saying here is you cannot look at a secondary waveform just at idle. If you have an air-fuel ratio problem or a compression problem, it's going to be necessary for us to bring that current drive and power break it and watch the spark line characteristics under engine-loaded conditions. Now, at point F, some of you guys that have gone to some of the old Sun or Allen or Bear schools, if you recall back in maybe the 70s and in the 80s, and I've even heard it in the 90s, where trainers would say that when you're looking at the coil oscillations, again at point F of your secondary waveform, most technicians says that they were taught that they need to see a minimum 3. Well, I can tell you from my past experiences, I used to train for Sun Electric, that was never technically correct. It's probably the last portion of the waveform you ever want to look at, because most problems can be caught at point C, point D, or specifically point E. If you have a weak coil and you enlist in that idea that you need to see a minimum 3 coil oscillations, if you look at my screen right now, you're only seeing 1.5. I can tell you there's nothing wrong with this coil. The minimum 3 coil oscillations, again, was never technically correct, so if you guys have enlisted in that, you need to throw that out. We have a higher rate of energy transfer on these coils now, and we actually started that back in the mid-80s. So typically, 1.5 is what you're going to see on most systems. We'll show you a little bit later on a General Motors Type 1 DIS coil pack, there are no coil oscillations. So we would tell you be very careful on condemning a coil by looking at the number of oscillations, and we'll show you various examples in the manual where typically about 1.5, maybe 2 is the normal on these modern day coils.